This is the Leadership Foundry podcast. I'm your host this week, Brandon Smith. And the purpose of this podcast, as you know, is all about leadership. And I am blessed, and we're blessed today to have Bill Bolling. He is not only the founder, but the longtime director of the Atlanta Food Bank. He's moved on to doing other things. He now spends more of his time as a connector, collaborator, convener, bringing folks together. But he's had such an incredible career, both in the Atlanta community and in food banks across this country, that his conversation today about leading organizations and starting up nonprofits is truly powerful. So I want you to pay attention to some of the leadership principles Bill hones in on, because frankly, regardless of whether we're in a not-for-profit or a big company or any other kind of organization, there's so much that we can learn from Bill. And of course, stay tuned at the very end. I will share my highlights and my notes. Bill, really excited to have you on the show today. Excited to not only hear a little bit more about your journey, but our topic about leading in the not-for-profit space.
Sure. Some
of the challenges around that. I cannot think of someone better to help guide us through that than you. So thank you for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to it.
So maybe a good starting place for those folks that have been around Atlanta for some time. They know you. You are famous. But for folks that maybe...
Well, I don't know about famous, but I have been around a long time,
very
Brandon.
well known for all of the impact that you've made in the Atlanta community, which has been substantial. So for folks that maybe are from out of state or maybe new to you,
yeah.
I would love to start with a little bit of your background. So share a little bit about kind of what, if you had to kind of give a career snapshot of some of the big things and highlights that you were most proud of, what's been your journey?
Well, let me give a little context. I'm from a small town in North Carolina, about 800 people. Everybody knew everybody. I joined the Air Force out of high school, 17 years of age. Had two uncles in the Air Force, so that's what we did in our family. Spent a couple of years in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, 67 to 69. And then started college on the GI Bill. So I went to college, got a business and teaching degree in North Carolina, and came to Georgia for graduate school. And I was studying psychology and counseling. But by that time in my life...
And was that Georgia State?
No, it was actually West Georgia.
West Georgia, okay.
And they had a very interesting, back in the 70s, they had a humanistic kind of a transpersonal psychology degree there. People came from all over the world, this little country school. But by that time in my life, what I was interested in is spirituality and how psychology and spirituality and mysticism, how that interfaced with each other. So it was a perfect school for me, a good time of my life, met my wife-to-be. And when I finished, we came to Atlanta and started a community, a spiritual community. Very idealistic, very committed. Started with several other people. And as I like to say, we were all graduate students. We had already been through our rock and roll, drugs, sex, that stage of life. We were here to serve, and the community was there. So we had Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and other people, homeless, mentally ill, and had two big houses there in Midtown. Interesting now as we think about Midtown. This is across from Piedmont Park. That was a rough area of town back then, and there's a lot of service to do. So one of the first, other than being the head of this community, we started a bakery, a restaurant, a book business, really with no money but free labor. But I really got called to work in ministry at St. Luke's Episcopal Church downtown. And during those days, churches either locked up or moved out of town. So a lot of churches had moved. Even First Baptist, who owned the whole city block down there, they moved everything out. St. Luke's decided to stay and open its doors, and we started the first community kitchen for homeless folks. And also was a part of starting the first training and counseling center and CPE training, clinical pastoral education for seminary students. First time it'd been done where the seminary students actually worked on the streets with the homeless. So that was fulfilling, I think, a deep call in me to serve. I had grown up in the country, grown up around food. You know, I had a grandfather that grew more food than we needed, and he'd ride around town and give it away. You know, he was my first food banker that I knew. But I did find that this really fulfilled, I think, a call, right? As I often say, we're all called to do what we can with what we have in the time given to us. Now, we often get caught up trying to compare ourselves to somebody else, or we're not significant in some way, but the real call is that, and you figure it out. That's God's grace to say the call is there. So I began working in a community kitchen, and what I found, interestingly enough, is that food really was the tool, but the work was around transformation. You understand what I mean there?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we made great soup and sandwiches, very particular, really focused on treating people with dignity, of being with people and not just doing things for people. And, you know, the idea of a food bank came out of, we were overwhelmed and just needed help. So I had been hustling for food. I wasn't above going down to Ansley Mall and getting things out of the dumpster, you know, brand new food down there. But the food bank idea had not been developed yet. I kind of found some others, and we created what's now Feeding America. I was a part of starting that whole movement. But I think I had 20, 22, 23 congregations that signed up. I promised them all the food. You know, by that time I could make you feel guilty if you're in any religion. You know, we're all called to feed the hungry or share what we have. So that really was the beginning. And then the food bank started many different programs. You know, I had 7 different brands there. Again, it was a platform, and food was the tool. And the model was to get food close to where people were, centralize the acquisition, and we could deal with tax policy, liability issues, you know, how do you handle multiple tractor-trailer loads, and get it to congregations or nonprofit groups like a mission or a Salvation Army. And this was rather new in the 70s. You know, now all churches do something. Back then, no. So that whole idea of centralizing acquisition, decentralizing distribution, the key was in the decentralizing distribution and getting the tools that congregations or nonprofit organizations needed to fulfill their mission. So to be a member of the food bank, and this is still true today, you've got to handle the food in a judicious way. You've got to keep track of it, you know, handle your finances in a certain way, because we've got to guarantee to the food donor that it's not going to get back in the marketplace, right? And then you've got to create incentives. So I tell that story, Brandon, because one of the first lessons I learned is needing food. I'd promised all this food. I didn't have a warehouse truck or anything. You know, you just kind of go out and promise it and try to produce it. But I knew it was out there. I went to Big Star. This is before Kroger or Publix. Or
I remember Big Star.
Big Star. And it was owned by a wonderful family, the Alterman family. And I marched myself over there on fire with this idea, you should give me food. Well, that didn't land well. First, they claimed they didn't have any. And, you know, back then I'd take pictures with a Polaroid camera and run around the front of the store and say, can I have what you just threw in there? But what I learned, and Steve Alterman, who recently passed away this last year, but he was the son of the founder and his uncle. Steve threw me out of the office first 3 times I went in there. He was having none of it. What I had to do is go say, Steve, teach me the grocery business. Well, he had a lot to say about that. And his issue is he couldn't track. So before UPC codes, for your listeners, we didn't always scan food, right? Before we had that technology, grocery stores had a hard time figuring out what they didn't sell. They called it shrinkage. And I had this idea of, what if I can inventory everything that you throw away? Well, all of a sudden, I'm a potential business partner, not a charity. So creating win-win and understanding your partners, whether they're partners that you're getting the food to or the partners that you're going to get food from, or all the folks in between of having to deliver that. You've got to figure out the win-win. You've got to be a good listener. You've got to be strategic. You got to ask a lot of questions, and you have to be able to measure the outcome. We were big on measuring things. We had a saying, things that get counted get done. And that was true in the whole food bank movement because we could account for what we were doing. So for a grocery store being able to inventory what they couldn't sell, they could manage better. They could tighten that up. Yeah. I remember a couple years into it where Steve called me up and said, let's have lunch. And I thought, well, great, let's have lunch, and he starts out with, this is really working out well for us, Bill. We're making more money. And I said, well, wasn't that the goal, Steve? He said, yeah, but I'm a little worried I won't have as much food to donate to you. Well, all of a sudden, you know that you're a partner because he's worried about the folks that I'm showing him that I'm feeding, and I'm doing it in a judicious way. So I would say everything I've done through the years has been on that basic philosophy of trying to find a win-win, of being a good listener, and then, of course, just surrounding yourself with great people. Yeah. If I had to define my leadership style, it would be as a servant leader. Yeah. And the way you measure a servant leader, of course, is are the people around you better educated, more empowered? Are they able to fulfill what their call is? And if you can help people with their journey, we get more done. And we can share that common mission, both personally and collectively.
Bill, what I love, so if I put one big theme over what you just said, the whole story, I love this idea of it's not about you, right? And you always were thinking about, how do I help this grocery store business? How to help these folks that need food? How do I help these congregations that want to serve folks outside their back door? How do I help them? So I love that you took that spirit and then you said, well, how can I be a better partner? How can I get more curious? How can I listen? How can I support them? How can I learn more about their world so I can get enough information to help them?
Well, and I think, later in life you get a lot of credit for being a visionary or, starting something new. I was desperate. I just needed to figure out how to get it done. The call was clear. The need was clear. And the tools to do it we had to develop, but they were all there. So getting a certain alignment. And then I think clarifying roles, that's, I think, really important because everybody's not good at everything. For instance, as a leader, you surround yourself with folks that they're very strong in an area you may not be as strong in, but collectively we get more done.
Yeah. And what I also love, again, in your story is so many of your principles could apply to really any organization.
Absolutely.
Higher education, not-for-profit, small business, large business. It's this whole balance of relational and operational. And building all those relationships, but operational stuff, like we got to measure. We got to be really clear on our goals. We got to be really clear on our roles. We not ask for feedback. Those kinds of things.
Well, I know you do some teaching and leadership, and I would say one of the challenges we have in this generation, or let's just say, the last 20 years, but it's getting more critical, is that so much of the work we do is transactional. Yeah. Right? And it can be done with a computer, or we can have a Zoom meeting or a Microsoft meeting. Out in the world, things are done in relationship. And if I can do anything when I teach a class, it is to say that it is relational. It is creating those roles. It's learning to build trust. And we see right now, politically, particularly in the political arena, where trust is so low. So I think that's important. And if you're creating win-win, you've got to be able to know, like I had to raise $30-40 million a year. Well, that's a lot of work. But if you're wanting people to invest in you, and I always use banking terms, I didn't want anybody to give me anything. I can give them $7 back on their investment of each dollar they would invest in the food bank, and I can show them that ratio. But that investment really is, you're going to be a partner in this. And then another important thing, I think, for people that feel a sense of wanting to lead, and I often do this when I do graduation speeches, is to take a moment and think, who wanted you to succeed? There's a lot of folks there that you may not even know. I mean, maybe your mom and dad did, or your uncle, or somebody in your congregation or community or your scout troop. But there's a lot of folks that have your back when you're young that you don't know about, that you learn about later. So one of the things for me was that people somehow thought I could do things that I didn't know I could do, but I thought, if they think I can do it, right? If they see something that maybe I haven't discovered in myself yet, or I don't have that confidence yet, but if they trust me, and I think that comes in my own case as, being trusted as a child. I mean, we grew up, I had my own tractor by the time I was 12 years old. I could ride around town and plow gardens for widows, or go to Little League practice on it. But that was a responsibility. If something broke on the tractor, I had to pay for it. So, you learn those things, and we just always worked in our family, in my father's work. So having that responsibility and expectation, and then as you're able to meet that expectation, it gives you greater confidence to do more.
I love that. You have some good parenting tips in there too, Bill. That's great. You're really good. All right, so you've already covered so much great ground on just best practices of leadership, timeless things, some things that we're sliding away from, because I think you're right. Too many businesses and organizations are getting transactional. Heck, you go into a hotel, half the time they want you to just, check in with your phone, not talk to another person. I kind of like talking to somebody. I like that hospitality, that feeling of connection and care. So I want to go a little deeper. You've got particular expertise in leading in the not-for-profit space. There's folks right now listening to this podcast that probably say to themselves, well, I'm in the latter portion of my career. I really feel called. I want to go start a nonprofit, be a leader in the not-for-profit space. Tell us a little bit about what's both exciting about that, but what's some of the unique challenges that you might not encounter if you were leading in a different environment?
Well, let's just say up front that there's all types and sizes and missions in kind of this social sector, right? So, but, the things we talk about are true kind of across. Any of us can, through life experience, be called to work in a certain area. It might be because of something happened in our own family or ourselves, or know somebody, and we'd say, I really want to work in that area. And I think there's an entrepreneurial spirit in our country that really doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. That kind of self-empowerment, I've got the idea. I think the first thing to do is, when you have an idea, or you really want to, feed the hungry or house the homeless, or, work on employment, is the first question is, who wants me to succeed? Right? Besides my mom and daddy, who wants me to have a real job here? Who wants what I have to offer? And what you're really trying to identify is what constituency of folks, whether it's companies, organizations, individuals, congregations, but every idea has a constituency. And if you hadn't figured that out, doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means it's a longer path. You've got to go develop that constituency. Then you've got to be able to articulate the vision, and you've got to right-size the vision. You can't go out there and claim, as some people do, I'm going to end hunger with this little pantry in the church. Well, probably not, but you are going to fulfill your call to do it, right? And kind of figure out who your strategic partners are. So, example at the food bank is I had to learn how to manage warehouses. I had to learn to put 20 trucks out on the road and track where they are. I had to learn development, public relations. In the 90s, I had to learn technology and software. So you can be an expert in any one of these areas and find out where you can contribute, because it takes all these things. There's no one person does it all, right? So finding strategic partners who can help you. Just like the story I told you when I talked to Steve, right? My answer to him is, well, you're winning, and you know what? I'm going to find other ways you can help me. You can help me manage my warehouse. You can give me a forklift. You can help me with transportation. What is your expertise that might help what I'm doing? At this stage, because I sat on several foundation boards, if you're in a foundation board and people come to you, there's two questions you got to ask right up front. Are you going to be sustainable? Meaning, are you going to keep coming back for the same thing? Or are you going to leverage my money? You always want to leverage your investment. Well, that's true in business, whether it's for profit or not for profit. So that really gets to having partnerships and saying how collectively, 4 and 4 adds up to more than 8. Collectively it adds up to more. So being able to answer those questions up front, how we're going to measure it, the impact, very important. Who are you going to work with? Who's your constituency? So getting to, if you're running a nonprofit, that constituency is important because you may start out oftentimes with a foundation grant. Somebody believes in you. Good foundations invest in people more than organizations, even more than your idea. They invest in people that they think can get it done. And that's something I learned, over time, because I was in there pitching my idea. But they got to believe that you can carry that idea out. So I think that's very important.
So what would you say are the challenges that most people wouldn't expect to encounter that exist in that not-for-profit space? What makes it challenging?
Here's another one. As you grow your idea, who you surround yourself, very important. But like any business, whether it's Coca-Cola or it's the Atlanta Food Bank or some little pantry, culture and get an alignment, around your mission is key. So there's a vision, then there's a mission, and then there's how are we going to live that out, and measure our outcomes. Oftentimes people start with a vision but can't really land, right? Even business, there's a market out there, but you've got to connect your ability to meet that and then surround yourself with the right people. I'll give you an example. Food bank, great idea. There was maybe 10 of us in the country back in the late 70s. We created an association, but we were always looking for new sources of food. Well, Atlanta's a big convention hospitality city, has been for years. And I thought, wow, there's just a lot of food in restaurants, right? So I was sneaking it out the back. I'll have to admit, it wasn't. We didn't have permission. We were going to ask forgiveness if we. But then we had this idea called Atlanta's Table, right, where we would get food from restaurants, caterers, special events. But then I had to work with the health department, and they were very cautious, very conservative. But I had to work with the hospitality industry, right? And you've really got to listen to what they need. They have very little storage space. They're very concerned about liability, right? They want the quality of the food not to change, because even if you're giving it away over at the Women's Mission, if the food's not good, that's not good for your brand. So we had to figure all those things out. And you become, again, a partner. You're fulfilling, because any industry like that, at the end of the day, they want to make things better. They want to have a successful business. But to make things better for the hungry and the homeless, to get children educated so that they'll be part of your labor force in the future, that we have good health care in the community so people, can show up for work and diabetes or something else like that. So you find out that we have common interests and we have different roles. So there's the public role, there's the business, and they pay taxes and often, will contribute. There's the nonprofit sector, there's the faith community. So anytime you're starting an organization like that, you may start with a foundation grant, but eventually you got to move toward long-term individuals. And the way to connect with individuals is to involve them in the work. So for the food bank, which most people know about the food bank because they've been down there sorting food, the business model depended on volunteers. It wasn't an add-on. A lot of places you go volunteer and you get there and they go, well, sit over there, we'll find you something to do. It's like, well, my gosh, I just drove 45 minutes. I thought you'd have something for me to do. Well, that happens every day. Didn't happen at the food bank. And as we got the technology, I knew who you were before you got there. Got you to sign in. Of course, you get your phone number and email. You're going to see 2 videos. You're going to do the work. We're going to measure it, and I'm going to invite you out the door to follow the food out the door. But by the time you got home, you get a thank you note and say, please come back. That sense of inclusion, that sense of measuring the pounds that you were involved, and then defining who's going to be the recipient, who's going to be helped by the work that you did, really closes the loop where people feel like they're a part of something. And then, of course, when you have, we were using 20,000 people a year, we had the biggest volunteer program. If Chick-fil-A said they wanted to have their volunteer day, I could handle 300 of them, right? Or, any company like that. So you've got to, build the capacity. So one of the things we did at the food bank was start a culinary training program. That was a natural for us, right? The way I did it is we had 600 organizations that we're serving. We could give them the profile of the kind of people that might want to have this kind of training. Then we went and got it certified. So it's a certified training program. I went to the Restaurant Association, who started having their monthly meetings at the food bank. We host them. And the hotels, and say, tell me how you want them trained. If I train them that way, will you guarantee them a job? So, you're fulfilling the whole thing. You know where you're recruiting people from. You know how to support them during that time, which pay them while they're in training, right? Because they're in a bad way anyway. And then you're guaranteeing them a job, and you're serving an industry that you want to serve you. Give us food. So I could tell that about any of the programs that we had at the food bank. Each one may have a different constituency of people that want you to succeed, and then they want to contribute toward that success.
So much in there, Bill. So much. So what I love is you came back to that comment you made early on, that food was more of a tool for transformation.
For me, that was my
But it
way.
sounds like you created programs that really allowed for transformation for everybody who was involved. Not just the folks receiving the food, but it could be the volunteers. I loved how you were so intentional about the volunteer experience. So
it was part of the business model.
And so it was good for the business model, but it was really also a good experience for the volunteers. They felt well supported, they felt trained, they knew what they were supposed to do, they had the resources they needed to do it, they felt successful at the end, and then they felt appreciated when they got home. So it was kind of a whole full circle. Yeah. So something else in your story that I want to come back to. I think sometimes leaders think, I'm going to lead my team, or I'm going to start a nonprofit, or whatever it is, and I'm going to be kind of focused on that. And while you spent a lot of your time more on the business than in the business. It seems like you were out in the community, spending a lot of time with partners, constituencies.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting stage in an organization, which I would say about 6 years into the food bank, where when I was out, and I needed to be out, building relationships, building trust, finding out, win-wins. When I was out, I thought, my gosh, I need to be back in. I mean, we got stuff to do. I need to lead the team. And when you're in, you think, I need to be out. Well, you can't live in that tension forever. So you've got to get help, and then you've got to train people and trust them, right, with that part of the business.
Yeah.
So picking the right people, educating, empowering them, holding them accountable, but they own that, right? And that's how you grow your business. And that's often an awkward stage. You feel so attached to it, you got to feel like I got to do everything. Yeah, it got beyond me in a hurry, and I found the right people.
Something else that you talked about early on that I made a note of, I think all organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, always deal with this tension between centralized and decentralized. And there's always this desire to become more centralized because there's a sense of more control. I can control all expenses. I can control the brand quality. I can control the experience. But then you lose the nimbleness and flexibility that decentralize allows you to do. And I loved how you talked about that you had to balance that. You could centralize acquisition, but you decentralize distribution, which at the heart of it, you just said, it requires trust. You got to trust those folks that you're going to hand that over to, that they're going to honor that, and you're going to trust the folks that are volunteers when you're gone and they're doing things.
Frankly, there was always resistance of, we could get food at our local Kroger, but I can tell you, we found out very quickly that store manager has authority to give you bread. He's not going to give you the other thing. He's not authorized. So you kind of got to go up the ladder. Who makes that decision? It could be at a regional, or it could be in Cincinnati with Kroger, or down in Lakeland, for Publix. Yeah. So most people running their pantries don't really get that whole business cycle. So you have to convince them that not only are you going to get the bread, that your friend in the congregation gives you out the back of the store, you're going to get everything in the store. And then as technology came along, you were able to see our inventory. So you could order before you got there. You didn't have to walk through and see if you found anything. You would order, we would pick the order and load you up. And then at this point, I think the food bank probably delivers 50-60% of the product to your door, just for the cost of gas to get there. So, it gets more sophisticated as we grow, but really understanding roles and building trust, and that it's a win-win is the key to growing.
So I think when I entered this conversation with you, I thought it's going to be a great masterclass on leadership in the not-for-profit space, and it has been. But I think it's been a great masterclass on leadership in general.
Well,
particularly on the importance of building and nurturing relationships and thinking about all the constituents that you serve and support, and thinking about those experiences, from the volunteers to the folks that are receiving the food to the partners. This has been fantastic.
Yeah.
So,
well, let me just mention at the food bank early on, mid-'80s, we thought if we're going to engage this many people, we need to educate them.
Yeah.
There was no curriculum. Couldn't find one. So we wanted to create what became Hunger 101. And actually, I found out graduate students at the public health school over at Rollins, that's the right curriculum for a course. I went over and convinced them to take a whole semester to write my curriculum. I mean, we had the data. We didn't know how to teach. So instead of trademarking that, we gave it away. We gave it to school systems, food banks all over the country. Then they get their own user groups. But then a certain number of people want to say, well, let's go up the river and say, who's throwing these kids in? Why are they hungry? There's a systemic issue going on. So we created an advocacy, and maybe 10% of the people want to choose to do that. So part of your responsibility, I think, when you engage folks is to listen to them and understand that there's many different ways to serve. People are called to serve in different ways, and you need to help facilitate that. Yeah. It's how you build that membership.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask this final question. So whenever we have a guest on the Leadership Foundry podcast, we always like to end it with kind of practical next steps. So if a leader's listening to this, maybe they're just leading inside their business, or maybe they're in a school system, or maybe they're in a nonprofit, or maybe they choose to one day, they're thinking they might want to start a not-for-profit. Well, what is something that leaders can take away from this conversation, something they can start doing today that's going to help them their teams, their ecosystem, their communities, their constituents thrive starting tomorrow? What's one thing they could start doing?
We've got to collaborate, and we've got to work across sectors between, say, business, government, the faith community, the nonprofit, social sector, because they all have roles. The government's got most of the money, right? But, they've got their needs too. So collaboration is the key. And we have all the tools for that, but it gets harder to do all the time.
It feels like the blockage is us being curious, asking those questions, which takes time. It's investing in those relationships, which is time.
To build trust, to give hard truth. In the political sector, what we have to do to get elected is promise more and more stuff for less sacrifice. Well, the message we need to deliver right now, just like with our grandparents and parents after the war, was for a whole generation, we're going to have to give more and get less. It's going to call for some sacrifice. And that's a message that is not well delivered today in any sector. It's all me, how fast can we do it? And we're
I
enamored.
can't imagine if I went home and my wife said, I got some news for you. You're going to have to give a lot more and you're going to get a lot less. I don't know how well I would go over.
It's the truth, and we'd have to trust that's true and that we're all going to be true, to that North Star. Yeah. And the people I've been blessed to work with, it's the greatest. It's just the greatest thing. There's just great people across the board. News is there to cover conflict and to cover things that would, get our eyeballs. But if we look out here in the community, there's just tremendous amount of good, creativity, just entrepreneurship. It is a very rich time and a time that we need that.
Yeah, it's exciting. Bill, thank you. Not only for all the things you've done for the Atlanta community and everyone else in other communities that have watched and learned from you, but the gifts you continue to give. This was amazing. I really appreciate your time.
I've been blessed. Thank you.
I absolutely loved my conversation with Bill. Frankly, it didn't go where I thought it was going to go. I thought he was going to talk to us about what it means to be a not-for-profit leader. But what he shared with us was what it means to be a great leader, regardless of what kind of role we're in. And the honing in areas that I want to focus in on, that I took notes on, a couple things. First, it's not about you. Always thinking about your constituents, everything from your employees to the folks you're serving, and really trying to maximize those experiences. That was one big takeaway I had. Second takeaway, always treat those as partnerships. Understand what matters to those folks, and then really be intentional to not only learn, but also measure. So you can come back and say, hey, this is what we've done for you, to create those long-term partnerships. And lastly, trust was a very big theme in everything Bill talked about. I loved his idea of centralized and decentralized, such an important tension that we have in business. And I had an aha for the first time in my career that in order to maintain centralization, you gotta trust. You gotta be willing to trust and let go. Because centralization is all about control. Decentralization is all about trust. And if we can balance both those things, great things can happen. I'm sure you took away a lot of different things for you. Regardless, as with all of the Leadership Foundry podcasts, the goal is for you to have something you can put into your toolkit today that's going to help you and your team thrive starting tomorrow.